About the end of last year, I interviewed on my show the chair of Transpower New Zealand, the people responsible for taking electricity all over the country and giving it to retailers who could then sell it to you. And he confessed that there was not enough electricity generation in this country as per now, or in 2035 in actual fact he mentioned, to meet New Zealand's desire to electrify everything. So our aim is to electrify everything to meet our climate change imperatives and certainly the policy priorities that we've set ourselves and the international agreements and treaties that we have come to also accept are going to run and drive our policy in that area. As part of this, though, there is this idea that a lake you've never heard of before and is sort of up in the foothills of central Otago, Lake Onslow, is going to be charged into a kind of battery. A new lake is going to be created. Now, that wouldn't be so bad, you'd think, if that lake was always going to be used in, well, I guess like a lot of lakes, Pukaki and Tekapo's come to mind, the man-made lakes of Benmore, Aviamore, Waitaki itself, the Clyde Dam, Roxburgh Dam. If those hydros were going to be creating electricity that we could then generate throughout New Zealand, that would seem quite a good idea. And it would be renewable and I guess it would create a construction dam. But no, we're not going to do that. We're going to create a battery dam, which is only going to be used for the dry years, won't be available at the very earliest until 2037, which is what? 14 years from now. And that's if the wind's behind us. And also is going to cost about $16 billion. Yes, you heard that right. $16,000 million. It is at that point the government has done prepared an indicative business case. It released that information along with 429 pages of documents a couple of weeks ago. And basically it said, well, against everything else, it still stacks up the best. Yes, but what did they compare it to? Well, they compared the Lake Onslow battery project to a series of other projects, none of which appear to be building new hydroelectric dams. Joining us to talk about this and the options that we might have in the future, including nuclear, is a former chief executive of one of the territorial authorities in that particular neck of the woods, but is now got his own environment consultancy firm, Ciaran Keogh. Good morning to you, Ciaran. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, what were you the chief executive of?
A good intro, yes.
Well, what were you the chief
executive of Clutha?
Oh, the Clutha District Council.
Both Clutha District Council, yeah, and Environment Southland. So, yeah, I've got a bit of been in the patch for a while.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you've got a pretty fair degree of background, both in terms of planning and policy, to bring to this particular issue. I've explained, I hope...
Well, yeah, we also worked for 4 years for ECNZ. Yeah, if I could also say we worked for 4 years for ECNZ on evaluating the Tuapeka hydro on the lower Clutha too, so we fairly intimately experienced some of the potentials down at that end of the country.
Now, this idea for a battery lake that's going to cost $16 billion, that's the latest estimate, and as I said, in the wilds of sort of central Otago, it came from, as I understand, an academic from Waikato University. I'm asking the obvious question, for $16 billion, how many hydro dams could you build on somewhere like the Clutha, which has already got 2, or the Waitaki, which has already got, 3?
Well, you could certainly build 2 small dams downstream of Clutha and possibly 2.5. There's a site above Miller's Flat that you could put a small dam in as well. And between them, they would generate more power every year than Onslow would in the dry year it's been set up for. And you could probably build it for about half the cost.
Wow.
What's been interesting is we've been conversing with people on this, and you can explain that to a 12-year-old in about 2 minutes, and they get the idea that building the dams on the Clutha is a whole lot better idea, and they generate additional power versus Onslow that generates it once in a dry year, which is the odd blue moon. And also you could build them quite quickly too, because they're relatively small structures. Whereas, and the problem with Onslow is that it seems to be based on the concept that dry years happen at reasonably predictive intervals, and they don't. They actually happen in series, so you tend to get dry phases and wet phases. And so your bloody dam up in Onslow would be really great for 1 year maybe, but what happens if you get 2 dry years in a row? Then you put all your eggs in one basket and the bottom's fallen out of it.
So you and I can see this. You can see it because you're an expert, and I can because I'm a sort of just an average Joe Blow going, it's a lot of money. Couldn't you build a new dam? Why aren't the dams that would contribute electricity on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis, to the New Zealand grid, why aren't they being considered as part of the options?
Well, I think it goes back to the whole corporatisation of generation. I mean, we were working for New Zealand, ECNZ back then, which was all of our generators in one big pile, and they thought strategically about the supply of electricity to the nation. And in fact, at the time they were broken up, the Crown owned all of the land required to build the dams in the Lower Clutha. It had purchased them all. And subsequently, the new owners of the hydro options on the Clutha sold all that land, so it disappeared from the community grasp. But basically, the generators now are there to maximise profit, not to maximise power supply to the nation. And you actually can't run something as fundamental to our economy as energy supply on a profit-making basis. There always has to be spare capacity, and you have to be building for future growth and needs. And that's an impossibility in the current market. And the government's trying to use various mechanisms to effectively stimulate supply, but it's against the natural instincts of a corporate model.
And so,
and the corporate model makes profit out of scarcity.
Yeah, and it's exactly, and we saw that recently 2 years ago or 3 years ago with Contact deciding to spill water from its Clyde dam because it wanted to keep spot prices high, which meant that it was making profit for itself, but for you and me, the consumers, we were having to pay more for our electricity.
Yep, you're right. Yep, and that's the fundamental problem, and that's the problem also with Onslow is that what they're thinking they can do is buy that electricity that would otherwise have been wasted by spilling in this corporate entity and storing it in Onslow. But it's sort of beggars belief that the system can think that that's a model that's viable. It actually leaves us with less power overall than we have now because they're using existing generation to pump this bloody spare water up the hill. Whereas putting the dams in the Clutha or the lower Waitaki provides additional generation. And in the sort of discussion papers, they're saying silly things like, oh, well, if we built that, it would just go to waste in the wet years. And you sort of think, who are these guys, buddy? Where are they coming from? And that if you have power that's being spilled or going to waste, it's cheap and people will do things with it. But the other silly thing about it is that if you had spare power in these lower dams, you would just hold water back in the higher dams. We've got huge storages in Tekapo and Pukaki and Hawea. And if you've got a surplus of power in a wet year, you just don't empty the water out. That's the problem, is they're emptying the top of the tank and then going to the bottom of the tank to pump it up, and it's ludicrous. We have,
but Ciaran, I think what you're suggesting is that the electricity reform model that we've got, which you're absolutely right, is about motivating profits for whoever the suppliers or who the manufacturers of the electricity are, is not the right one because it trumps or truncates the national interest. But surely, if the national interest is such, and we are in this position where we're actually wanting to electrify everything because we've made all these international commitments around climate change, then surely it's not hard for the government to decide that it is going to direct as a part of its functional role as representative of the common people.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it should actually just put the system back together again that we had before the corporate model came in. It worked really well. And it was simple and straightforward. You didn't need electricity markets and all sorts of strange bloody bureaucracies. And you also had, and this is one of the things that this corporatisation has destroyed, you actually had a critical mass of really technically capable people sitting in one entity in Wellington whose primary responsibility was providing energy for New Zealand as an economy and a society. And now it's all fragmented. We've lost it. We had some of the world's best dam builders, engineers that really knew what they were doing. And these guys were planning ahead, and that's all disappeared.
All right. Now, the other interesting thing that you suggested is there is another option that's cheaper still, it would appear, and that is the movement towards some small nuclear power reactor in the North Island, so closer to where the markets would be for that electricity. We have this great aversion in this country which seems philosophical rather than practical. Is that the only thing that inhibits us here? Because other countries are seeming to move down the nuclear route as both the greenest solution but also the most practical.
Well, I think there's two things in there. One is that I think that when you look at this whole discussion, certain things have been dropped right out of it that need to be discussed, and nuclear is one of them. I mean, I'm not an advocate for or against it in reality. It's just that it is one of the options in the future, and it seems like a sensible one for a variety of reasons, and one is that Auckland in particular is incredibly exposed to the vulnerabilities of our entire network. You've got Taupo sitting there, and every now and then it goes gurgle, and if it went bang, it would take out quite a lot of generating capacity out of the Waikato, and it would probably also disrupt transmission to Auckland in a substantial way for some time. And you've really got a couple of wind farms up there to keep the place going if that happens. And you've also got, transmission across the Alpine Fault and a number of other faults. So there's a whole raft of vulnerabilities between where most of the power is made and where most of it is consumed. And so taking generation at least sufficient to keep the main city in our country running in an emergency, at an emergency level at least, seems like an incredibly sensible thing to do. And that's another silly thing about Onslow, is that we've already got delivery constraints in the grid from the south end of the South Island to Auckland, and you're going to stick another $15 billion in there. I mean, for $15 billion, you could put bloody solar panels on every house in Auckland and given to for nothing. And those are sorts of things that just aren't even being considered. And again, it all comes back to the fact that we've got, these private models who, by sheer coincidence, the Crown happens to be 50% owners of and quite likes the cash flow.
That's the next. You see, my wife asks this question all the time, and she says, "We're building all these new houses. Why aren't solar panels compulsory on them all?" She says, "Wouldn't that?" She said, "Just you put it on."
Not just compulsory; they can afford to actually pay you. I'm actually building a new house now, and I was thinking of putting solar on it. I mean, it cost me $20,000 to get a cable 25 metres from the nearest pole. And you sort of think, oh, should I go solar? But the problem is, if I spent $40,000 on solar, I'd still need to put a gas stove and a gas hot water in. And so you need to be grid connected for solar to work. But it's just uneconomic.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
the value that question. Yes.
All right. Now, and finally,
really idea, but it's a shared thing.
Yes, and finally, on this issue, is this an election issue? So, is there a philosophical loving for Lake Onslow? I think the National Party and the ACT Party have both said that they will not proceed with it, because very much for the same reasons that you've promoted as well, because it just doesn't seem to make economic sense, that there are better alternatives available and that they haven't been explored. Well, how come it's got so far in the process, and the Energy Minister I just saw last week really seems to love the idea? Why is Lake Onslow regarded as such a white knight?
Well, because there's another problem in all of this is it's called the trough, and that everybody that's involved in advising the minister has a whole pile of incentive to continue the investigations because there's tens of millions of dollars in it, and nobody's going to stand up and say this is a stupid idea. Why are we getting all this money to tell you that it's a good idea? They just keep bloody doing what they're doing, and I'll tell you, it happens all over New Zealand. And it's again, the problem is that their sources of advice are no longer impartial.
That is a very good point you've just made. Ciaran, thank you so much for joining us.